So this shutter, I've got to remove the lenses front and rear. Let's try the rear one first. I'll use a friction tool on it. That spins loose. The front, let's try that. Yes, that spins loose too. If you haven't got a set of friction tools, they're well worth getting. They're usually relatively cheap. I think this particular set came out of India, I think, but you'll find something from India or China or one of the major suppliers. Right, now I can start opening this up. So there's a lock screw under here, or cam, and it's hidden under the Kodak nameplate. So first I've got to remove one of these two screws. Pop that carefully over there, swing that nameplate aside, and there's this pinhead lock screw here, just needs to be rotated. It's actually a rivet, it's not a screw. Just rotate that to the flat sides to the centre, and then this cover just bayonets on. Of course it doesn't want to lift off. Let's bring it off with the speed ring. That is exceptionally unenthusiastic about lifting off. See if we can get under it. Yep, there we go. It's just stuck. You can see that filth there, that's dried grease. That was gluing it onto the speed ring, stopping it from lifting off. Right, to off with the speed cam ring, which is very reluctant to move. Again, that's very sticky, and we're into the shutter. Well, I'll take the plunger off so I don't lose that. This main drive ring here is called the main lever. I'll unhook the spring for that. That scarcely moved, it's that sticky. Pop that to one side. And start stripping down the various levers in the camera. This little lever here is the latch that holds the cocking action in the cocked position. It holds the main lever in the cocked position. Here I need to remove. Why is that not moving? That's because it's so sticky. That's better. I'm just depressing the shutter release to bring this arm towards the centre so I can get at the screw holding that shutter release socket there to the mechanism plate. There we go. There's a spring on this arm, just getting in behind that and lifting it up. So I can lift that arm out. And here's the 500th of a second or high speed spring. Our shutter release lever should lift off now. This has got a very fine spring on the back of it. Be careful not to damage or lose that. Deeper. This little lever here holds the shutter open on B or T. Does the shutter have T as well? It does. It's got a T setting. So that's held in with a screw and a brass bush take the lever off and its return spring. There's another little lever here. Typically you don't need to remove that. Just making sure the screw's done up reasonably tightly, that's fine. And now I can split the shutter. There's 3 screws from the back hold the shutter case and the mechanism plate together. So I'll loosen these 3 screws. Those 3 screws were identical to each other. This be the last thread of that one still gripping. Right. And I can lift the shutter case off the mechanism plate. Put the mechanism plate to one side for a second, look at the shutter case. And this is very sticky. I can tell by the way I can slightly jiggle the setting lever before the blades even look like twitching that the blades are what's sticking this up. It's oil on those blades. You can probably see the pattern of oil on those blades there. So they all need to be cleaned. And the mechanism plate. Well, our shutter blades here look a little bit oily. You can probably see the staining on that blade. Its mates will be no better. And that oil sticks them together. The mechanism plate itself, and this is the blade actuating ring. It doesn't seem too bad actually in terms of stickiness. This lever on the top of the shutter works the blade actuating ring. It feels a bit stiff. Let's have that off. There's one screw. Very occasionally there's a very thin shim washer on the top here. Not very frequently found, and it's only where this bush was slightly higher than the thickness of that little arm so that it rattled about, but you don't find that very often, so don't be surprised if you don't see a washer there. 3 screws hold this retainer to the mechanism plate. Now that screw is loose. If these screws are loose they can catch on the shutter blades, and that loose screw is loose too, and prevent the shutter from working correctly. That's uncommon, you don't find that very often. All 3 of those were slightly loose. Take off the retaining plate, take off the blade actuating ring, and these parts can all now be cleaned. And there's a lot of grime on this shutter. You can see dirty yellow brown grease here. All that's got to be cleaned away. A lot of that black or dark grey staining there. Maybe graphite grease, but it's just as likely it's from the aluminium itself, and it's just stained. Just looking at the shutter body here, there's a little bit of a rough bit right there where that latch comes in. Just seeing what that is, whether it's a loose thread of metal or whether the metal's just, it's very thin here. I don't know whether it's just broken away. It has. That's all right. That does no harm. That's that. Let's have a look at the retard gear train. Now, if I pull this lever outwards, that should release the pallets. Oh, and that pallet lever is very sticky. But the mechanism itself seems to work quite well. Now, this sticky pallet lever certainly could be a problem. It would slow up the action of the shutter. All of this has got to be flushed with naphtha, and that's the next trick really, is cleaning all these parts up. I've got to disassemble the diaphragm setting at the back here. 3 screws hold the retaining plate in place. On later shutters you can remove the setting lever with this mechanism intact, because the plate has a cutout that you can access the 2 screws under here with. This is an earlier shutter, it does not have that. We can tip out our shutter. Here we've got the case and the 2 screws I just mentioned that hold the settings lever to the back of this mechanism. All of this looks quite oily. Yeah, you can probably see the oil and grease and filth on the back of this. All of this is supposed to be clean, and that's what I've got to do next. Time to start reassembling the shutter now, and I start with doing the aperture, the diaphragm. So here's the retainer plate. Now I want the flat side, plain side up, and then start putting the clean blades back in place. Now the blades are not symmetrical. The rivet that forms the pivot on each end of the blade is closer to the corner of the blade at one end and closer to the centre of the blade at the other. The end I'm fitting into the retainer plate here is the rivet or pivot that is closer to the centre of the blade. If you mix these up, it won't go well. These blades are slightly distorted, and that will be because they've been sticky with grease and oil, and as a result the forces applied to the end of the blade in order to rotate it have translated as much into distorting, pushing on and bending the blade instead of just rotating it around the pivot at the other end. And once they've got a bit of a bend on them, they do not want to lay flat. Of course, doing this particular job requires that the blades lie flat with no arguments, otherwise it's very difficult to get all of the pivots into the sockets all at the same time. And here of course I've got the blades are overlapping, and one blade there I think just popped out of its spot, and this blade I've laid on the paper the wrong way round, so I've got to make sure I haven't done that anywhere else. Now that looks right. I usually lay the blades out in the same orientation so that I can pick them up and place them correctly with a minimum of fuss. This is the last of the blades. Now the earlier blades I've got to lift back up over the top of that last blade without disturbing anything. And swing all of those blades back in against the jig, like that. Now, pop that aside for a moment. I've got to fit this disc back in the case, and that couples to the setting lever here. So I'll better get set up to do that. Let's get this in position. goes on that way. It's easy to tell with this particular shutter because it has two aperture scale pointers, so it's not hard to line things up. Get the screw started on that side and get the screw started on this side. I'm supporting the setting ring from underneath on the edge of the wooden block, which allows me to tighten the screw without damaging anything. Just checking that the action's nice and smooth. Now I've got to fit this over the top of the other thing. So yes, that's at the fully open position. Checking the fixing screw spots, which are here, here and here. And align those two screw holes. I've got to align with these two holes here. And I'm checking that the slots here, the alignment of those relative to those particular screw holes. It's about there. Let's see if I can lower this into place and pick up those pivots into the slots. I can feel them clicking into place as I apply a bit of downward pressure. So I'll flip this over, lift my jig up, pop it through underneath. And I can just got to pull this round to line up the screw holes where I fix this to the case, and I can see one of the pivots is not in position. I'm just going to get these screws started to hold things in place, and then I'll have to try and pull that blade into position. So I just want to get these screws started and run down lightly. There's the third one here. Now looking at these blades, and I can see that this blade is well out of place. It should be round here further. See if I can manoeuvre that into position. This one's slightly out. Oh, that's just about right there. See if we can pull that into position with the tip of my tweezers. No, it's there. This one's slightly out. That looks all right. I'll just tighten this screw lightly. So I've got three that are not correctly positioned. I'll just tighten this screw lightly too. I'll lift that off so I can see what I'm doing. This one here is more concerning, that's further round than it should be. I'll try moving the setting lever, see if that will encourage them round slightly. It almost looks like one's not sitting down in the place there. Yeah, definitely one is. Oh, I can just see the end of that. I'll find a needle. See if I can pull this into position. That one I've just disturbed. Let's tighten that screw up slightly to keep that in place. That one's in position, one more to go. Right, I can see which way I need to move it. There it is. So all of the rivets are in position. I'll just tighten that plate down slightly. Check that the blades swing in and out smoothly. They do now. One just dropped into place. Previously it can't have been sitting in the slot correctly. So that's good. I can tighten those 3 screws up. Check that that moves smoothly. It does. So those blades are all nice and clean now, free from contamination of oil. And that's our shutter case dealt with. I need to turn my attention to the mechanism plate. Check this retard gear train. Oh, that arm's still sluggish. That's disappointing. I've just cleaned that and it appeared to be quite good when it was wet with solvent. I'm going to use a different solvent on that. Well, that action seems fine now. I can start reassembling the rest of it. First I'll start with the blade actuating ring. It only fits in one position. Here's our retainer plate. It has a rivet on it which locates it, so you shouldn't get that in the wrong position. This is held in with 3 screws. In this case they're all the same length. On some shutters you'll find that one of the screws is longer than the others, and you'll need to take note of where it came from. Typically it's over here. Just run that screw in lightly. Get the other 2 in position. Just start those. Check that everything is moving freely. Not getting a full range of movement there. What's gone on? Oh, the B and T setting lever, I've got it on the wrong side. Let's just take this off and push that back into the correct position. It needs to be back over here. Check that moves freely. That's better. Full range of movement. Tighten the 3 screws. Check again. That's good. On the top, this lever which operates it, I normally give that a wipe with molybdenum paste in the 2 holes, the one that's the pivot and the one that picks up the post on that blade actuating ring. Fit this retaining screw. Tighten that, swing it across, fit the return spring, and check the action. It's nice and snappy, that's good. How's this lever now? Yes, that's better too. The mechanism plate's all clean now. I'll just swing the blade, that lever outwards, disconnected the spring from here. That puts the blade actuating ring into the blade open position and start stacking the blades back in place. First blade goes here, second blade here, third blade, fourth blade, and fifth blade. The shutter case can be put on top. The 3 holes are not symmetrical, so it's not hard to find where this case is going to fit. It should be there. Line up the screw holes, 3 case screws. Run the screws down, don't tighten them up yet. flip the shutter over, check that the blades close correctly. They do. I'll hook its return spring in place. Turn the shutter back over, tighten the 3 case screws. That's our basic shutter reconstruction done. Now I have to fit all the control components into the top. First component to get back in is this lever. This lever controls the action of the B setting and the T setting. See if I can get this in position. A small brass bush that goes in on top of the blade, and the fixing screw goes through the bush into the mechanism plate. Let's see if I can get that to stay in place. The spring's pushing it away, so it's not playing the game. Swap hands, so I can get it easier if I do the other way. It's started. That bush is not sitting correctly in place, or more accurately, the lever is not sitting central in the bush. That's better. Put that screw up. Now this end of the spring here has to come up and go to the inside of this lever here. So this lever is now sprung loaded, and this lever of course is sprung loaded. That's good. Next stage. We can put our 500th of a second speed spring in, and this lever. A wipe of molybdenum paste. Drop that lever into place. This lever has quite a strong return spring on it. Let's put a tiny smear into the pivot, and that spring goes in underneath the 500th of a second speed spring. Sits on that pivot, and I should be able to tuck the spring down into the case, get that all seated. That looks good. This is the latch that holds the shutter in the cocked position. In this particular shutter, that doesn't have a return spring of its own. Got the shutter release lever here. I'll just wipe some molybdenum paste down those two notches and into the pivot. This has a return spring on the arm there, and I can see that that's very reluctant to return, so I'm going to have to flush that with some solvent. That's much happier now. See if I can get this into place. Actually, I might have to lift this lever out in order to do that. Making sure its return spring stays correctly positioned. You can see the T action there. And while I've got it there, I'll apply a little bit of molybdenum paste to the levers that this acts against. It looks good. Now I'll put this lever back in position. Make sure the 500th of a second speed spring is around on this side of the screw. That looks correct. That spring tucked down. And so the spring on this lever is the return spring for the shutter release button. If we hold down the shutter release, I can slide this cable release socket into position and drop its fixing screw into place. Do that screw up tight. That's good. Here's our shutter release plunger. I've cleaned that. I'll just put a wipe of molybdenum paste on that shaft and work that in. Screw this in. It's certainly working. Can't tell if there's any undue friction there. Put some molybdenum paste right on the end of that plunger. Except that seems fine. And we have the main lever, which I need to put some molybdenum paste on. So, inner and outer surfaces on the bird paw and that little upright tab on the bird paw. Some on this tab here. That's where it couples to the retard gear train. And on the retard gear train, some on that surface, just some on that lever, there and there. That's sufficient. I'll fit this spring into position. Hold back the pallet lever, swing back the lever at this end, make sure this isn't trapped underneath, make sure that's sitting correctly. Yeah, that should just about run down from there. What's catching me? The B lever, I think. Is that the spring? It's spring. That's better. Take that spring in, hook it over its post. It's not keen to play the game. That's better. Check that that's okay. Everything in position. Molybdenum paste on the speed cam setting ring. Run it around those cam positions where the speed train lever runs. And the 500th of a second speed spring here runs on the inside of here and on this edge here. That's fine. I'll get this in position. Make sure that the B lever is not trapped underneath, that's better. That's in the B setting, or T setting rather. That's the B setting. This will be the 1 second speed. That sounds good. Now it's worth noting that with this shutter you do not cock the shutter to set it to B or T. If you try and do that you'll break something. That speed sounds good too. Let's put this cover in place. Rotate that to bring the lock into position. Rotate the lock. Swing our nameplate back. Fit the screw holding the nameplate in place. Tighten the screw at the other end of the nameplate. That's done. Just got to put the lens on now. Front lens group. Just done that up tight with my fingers because that's all that's required. The rear lens group. Again, that's all that's required. That shutter can go back on the camera body. So, here's our shutter. Fit the retaining ring in place. Check the alignment. The alignment's easy enough to sort out because at the infinity position we need our infinity line here to line up with the pointer at this point on the shutter. There. I'll zoom you in a bit so you can see that mark. There's our white infinity line, and there's the infinity mark on the focus scale ring. They need to match when the focus scale ring is all the way back to the infinity position. Now I'll try tightening this up without shifting anything, which is the challenge. See how I did. My shutter needs to come round slightly. Let's try loosening that off and shifting it slightly. Oh yeah, try that. Not quite. Yeah, that should do it nicely. So there we have it. That camera is all fit to go. If we cock the shutter, let's set that to a suitable speed. A 50th will do nicely. Cock the shutter, advance the film, push the lever across, advance the film. I'm rolling the film sprocket until it locks. Press our shutter release. Shutter fires, release pops back up nicely. Press our lever, allows us to wind on to the next shot. Cock the shutter, fire, and so forth. Done. Thanks for watching.